established a new target, which is a 25% reduction below 1990 levels. And I think this has caused a lot of disarray as to just how will this be achieved. Now, the other distinguishing feature, and this is still, well, two important caveats on this number. One is that the number was put forward in the context of there being an international commitment to move forward, some kind of international agreement. Now, exactly how that would work was not made very clear, whether it was triggered by a treaty or triggered by substantial commitments by other countries. There are lots of ways it can go. But, so there was a caveat and a contingency on this, which had not been in the earlier target. As well as it appears that, and again, this is a little unclear to me right now, so perhaps if someone here has a better answer, it appears that international trading would be allowed to be counted within this target. So you've got a 25% below 1990 level, you've got a different base year, different number, and different universe of what's being counted. But besides that, it's all trading. But I think the reaction has been, and in talking with government officials and with others, that this is a very steep target. I had one official liken it to getting to Mars, perhaps, would be perhaps something that would happen before they got to that level. So I don't think that was an official statement of policy, but clearly, from especially the industry's point of view, this is a very tough target. So the question really becomes on what are the policy measures that are going to be used? How will the new government try to drive forward to this midterm target? There's not been much information yet on specific steps beyond the current suite of efficiency measures, low carbon, low emission vehicles, emphasis on nuclear power, which again, like the Obama administration, I think the Obama administration has had to accept nuclear power, though they have some misgivings about it, but they recognize that as a low-carbon energy source for Japan, this is a very important option and need to continue moving forward, but it is not embraced, I don't believe, in quite the same way the LDP had not embraced it in the past. There's been quite a bit of debate and examination of the possibility of installing a cap-and-trade mechanism, as we are discussing in the U.S. right now. So I think that would be one approach. And then other analysts have been looking at it and saying there's no way to do this without a very steep carbon tax as well being put in place. So all of these things are open. Some of that because implementation is contingent on what happens within the international sphere. The other interesting initiative that Prime Minister Akiyama has engaged on is what he's called the Akiyama Initiative, which is an international initiative in which he has pushed, and he mentioned this in his UN speech on climate change, that very active engagement internationally. I think he wants to be seen as a leader on this international engagement. One example of that was a $400 million loan to Indonesia that they announced would be used for climate change purposes. It was done at the APEC summit at that time. So he clearly wants to be a leader in moving forward along this pathway. So this brings us to the question of the interests of Northeast Asia and the U.S. in terms of dealing with the problem and what are the ways to be working together. And I think GRIFFIN provided a very good rundown of some of the mechanisms that could be put in place as multilateral mechanisms. So the U.S., Japan, and Korea are all members of these international groupings. So the APP, the MEF process, quite a bit of bilateral work. But I think that it's really interesting to pull apart Northeast Asia, if you count that as China, Korea, and Japan, and look at how the interests line up. So for the U.S. and Japan, very similar sets of interests and objectives, but working very closely on these interests for a long time. Economies are in some ways similar positions of growth is going to be perhaps lower than it has been in the past. For Korea has an interesting place. It has joined the OECD, so like the U.S. and Japan are both members of the International Energy Agency, so sharing in those sets of principles, but still looking at much higher growth rates than the other two, striving for higher growth rates to continue the development process. And then the U.S. and China, of course, have been singled out as the key players in the trying to develop this international framework moving forward. It brings me back to the unique position I think that Korea has in this endeavor, in that it still has the aspirations and attributes of a developing country needing to maintain higher growth rates, but it's starting to move and embrace the concept of doing that with a low carbon profile, and I think we'll hear more about that in just a second. That helps bridge between the U.S.-Japan interests and the China interests. So I think that through the discussions and dialogue between these four parties, you can actually start having this discussion, and this gets back to our project on low carbon pathways, to say how can you get there? To my mind, if Korea, though much smaller than China, has made the decision that they can maintain economic growth while committing to a lower carbon future, then that perhaps provides examples for China to follow. And I think they are starting on that pathway in the future. I think another major area of common approach is going to be on nuclear power, that all four of the countries are looking at nuclear power as a major way in which to address their need for low carbon energies. Korea is very much a leader in this area. Japan has been a leader as well, and I think the new government will continue that. China has a tremendous buildup of nuclear power as a part of its strategy to achieve its energy moving forward. So I think that's another area for potential cooperation and collaboration down the road, including an interest in how do we make a world in which we've got a framework that helps us deal with proliferation concerns, because as nuclear power is being adopted throughout the world, all four of these countries are going to share a strong interest in that. And then finally, I think within the Copenhagen context, this discussion on monitoring and verification is key, and is an area where the U.S. and Japan have, I think, very similar positions, that we need to have very strong monitoring and verification systems in place. And I think China is still clearly, I guess reluctant, maybe an understatement, but is not yet ready to put itself under that. And this brings me to I guess my final point, which is, I mentioned the three countries, Japan, Korea, and the U.S. being involved in an International Energy Agency, trying to bring China within that framework of the International Energy Agency, which I think may be a place in which we can start looking at expanding the role of the IEA to perhaps pick up some of this work of reviewing how countries are implementing their low-carbon energy policies. This has not been a part of the work of the IEA, but I think perhaps it's something to look at in the future. So thank you very much.
That's an excellent rundown, Bruce. We're now going to get a rundown on Korea. Greg Galati, go ahead and do that.
Thank you, John. Since I represent KEI on this panel, I would like to thank John Lemon, Griffin Thompson, David Pomfret for joining us today. Margot, Patrick, Nick, Troy, thank you very much for your great work on this program. This is a relatively interesting low-carbon green growth at KEI. Is a relatively recent interest, and I would like to take this opportunity to very quickly thank our interns for their great work done on low-carbon green growth research. Andy Leon, Kim, and Amanda Curcio. This is not only a very new area at KEI, but after decades of rapid industrialization, accelerated economic growth at the expense of the environment, low-carbon green growth was brought up, of course, by an address on August 15th, 2008, on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the Republic, when President Kim Myung-bak explained that after an agricultural, industrial, and information revolution, we're on the verge of an environmental revolution. And he also emphasized Korea's commitment in this area of low-carbon green growth. And of course, this issue also came up in the summit meetings between President Kim Myung-bak and President Obama in June in particular. So what are the origins of Korea's interest in low-carbon green growth? Korea is a country that is about the size of the state of Maryland, a population that's pushing 15 million. Between 1912 and 2008, the temperature rose by 1.74 degrees centigrade, and also the sea level over the past 40 years rose by 22 centimeters. There's acute awareness of the environmental degradation and the need to do something about it in Korea. Secondly, in light of the recent crisis in particular, it has become evident that dependence on fossil fuels is one of Korea's greatest vulnerabilities. 97%